Was Jesus based on the Egyptian god Horus? Many mysticists claim Jesus never existed. It was just a copy of the deity Horus. They claim there are several parallels which prove this, such as Horus was born of a virgin Isis on December 25th in a cave. A star in the east announced his birth, and he was visited by 3 wise men. He had an earthly father named Seb, which translates to Joseph. He was baptized by Anup the baptizer. He had 12 disciples. He performed miracles, like walking on water, and raised Osiris from the dead. He gave a sermon on the mount, was crucified between 2 thieves, buried for 3 days, and was resurrected. He was called Christ, Anointed One, the Way, the Truth, and the Light, Messiah, Son of Man, and many other titles that are applied to Jesus. So it is pretty clear the story of Jesus is just a myth copied from the deity Horus. Well, that might be true if any of these claims about Horus were in fact true. The fact is, most of this nonsense is a lie, and we can't find it anywhere in ancient Egyptian literature. First off, Horus's mother Isis was not a virgin and was actually married to Horus's father, Osiris, and she is shown in depictions as a falcon hovering over an erect Osiris. There is no reason to think Isis was a virgin, as most Egyptologists do not even claim this. One legend even has Isis sleeping with the dead body of Osiris, and Horus was conceived from that. So there is no reason to think Horus was born of a virgin. There is also no evidence Horus was born in a cave, let alone a manger. James Fraser says Horus was born in a swamp, and there is no evidence of a star in the east or 3 wise men. Let's also remember in the Gospels, it doesn't say 3 wise men visited Jesus. It says an untold amount of magi visited Christ after his birth, but it never says 3. As for December 25th, this also cannot be confirmed. One reference has Horus being born in November, whereas Plutarch says Horus was said to have been born around the winter solstice, but there is no evidence for the 25th in particular. Also, Jesus was never confirmed to have been born on December 25th. It was just an estimate based on early calculations, but never confirmed or written in the New Testament. Seb was never said to be Horus's earthly father. In fact, Seb was a god, the god of the earth, or the earth itself, and there is no linguistic connection to the name of Joseph. Some references say Seb was the father of Osiris, not Horus. There is no Egyptian scholar who has ever heard of Anup the baptizer. This was just made up out of thin air by mysticists. Horus was never said to have 12 disciples. Some legends say he had 4, and some just say he had an untold amount. Horus did perform miracles, but that would be expected from any deity. As for walking on water, there is no evidence of this. He also didn't raise Osiris from the dead. Osiris didn't come back to life, but remained in the underworld to serve as god of the dead. Plus, there is no evidence Osiris was ever referred to with the prefix El. This is just not true in Egyptian mythology. There is no evidence Horus gave a sermon on the mount, no evidence he was crucified, let alone between 2 thieves, no evidence he was buried, and no evidence he was resurrected. He was never called Christ, Anointed One, the Way, the Truth, and the Light, or any of these titles commonly associated with Jesus. Modern mysticists have simply lied, or lack any ability to do accurate research, because all of these supposed claims about Horus simply do not exist in Egyptian mythology. And until these mysticists provide actual original source evidence for these claims, there is no reason to believe them. So since that is the case, there is no evidence Jesus was a myth based on Horus. Was Jesus based on the Persian god Mithra? Christ mythos will claim Jesus never existed and was just a copy of Mithra, because Mithra was born of a virgin on December 25th. He was a traveling teacher and performed miracles. He had 12 disciples. He sacrificed himself for world peace, was buried in a tomb, and resurrected 3 days later on Easter morning. His followers were promised immortality. He was called the Good Shepherd, Savior, Redeemer, the Way, the Truth, and the Light. His holy day was Sunday, and his followers partook in the Lord's Supper every week. So do we have proof that Jesus was a mythic copy of the god Mithra? Well, for that to even be remotely true, some of this nonsense would have to be factually correct, and in fact it is not. First, there are actually 3 different versions of Mithra, and none of them match Christianity. Most who try to claim this tend to think the Mithra of the Roman cult is where Jesus came from, but this mystical religion surrounding Mithra didn't leave any writings behind for us to know what they believe, so we have to piece most of it together from secondhand sources and inscriptions. First, it is unlikely Mithra was born of a virgin. All sources indicate the Roman version was born out of a rock. This is also confirmed by Commodianus. In other versions, Mithra was created as an adult by Ahura Mazda. And even in Persian versions of Mithra, there is no indication from inscriptions he was born of a virgin. As for December 25th, Roger Beck states this is just absolutely wrong. In truth, the only evidence for it is the celebration of the birthday of Invictus on that dated calendar of Philocalus. Invictus is of course Sol Invictus, Aurelian's sun god. It does not follow that a different, earlier and unofficial sun god, Sol Invictus Mithras, was necessarily, or even probably, born on that day too. There is no evidence Mithra was ever called a traveling teacher. As for performing miracles, such a task was said of just about every deity, and is way too general to form any parallel. There is no evidence Mithra had 12 disciples in any version. In the Persian or Iranian version, he had one companion, who was Varuna, and in the Roman version, he only had 2 companions. The idea that Mithra had 12 disciples is taken from this image of Mithra slaying of the bull, where he is surrounded by 12 figures. But these are not disciples, they are the signs of the zodiac. Plus, this inscription postdates Christianity, so it cannot mean any type of dependency. There is no evidence Mithra sacrificed himself for world peace, and Christ mythers have yet to provide any evidence. The closest one can get is the story of Mithra slaying the bull, but that doesn't compare to Christianity at all. As for his burial and resurrection, this is just an outright modern lie. There is no indication in any version of Mithra that he died, let alone was buried and resurrected. The closest one can get is a piece of graffiti dated to after 200 AD, which reads, "And us too you saved by spilling the eternal blood." However, every Mithric scholar notes this refers to the spilling of the bull's blood, not his own. The Mithric cult probably did promise their followers immortality, because that was customary in almost all religions, and is way too general to force any type of real parallel. But even if this is true, we still aren't really sure, because again, we simply don't have any Mithric writings left for us. Roger Beck even suspects that in the Mithric religion, there was never any specific ritual about the soul's journey after death. Mithric was never called the Good Shepherd, Savior, Redeemer, the Way, the Truth, and the Light, or any common title that is applied to Christ. These are just outright lies. Now it is true that Mithra's holy day was on Sunday, but given there are only 7 days in a week, and the first day of the week was significant for many cultures, it is hardly evidence of borrowing. Plus, we should also note, most of our knowledge on the Mithric cult comes from after the time of Jesus. So if there was borrowing, it is more probable it was the other way around, meaning the Mithric cult stole from Christians. Michel Zalzman even notes the Mithric cult use of Sunday postdates the New Testament. Finally, there is no evidence of a Lord's Supper in the Mithric cult. Any reference to this comes from very late medieval texts that cannot be trusted. So since that is the case, there is no evidence Jesus was just a myth based on Mithra. Was Jesus based off the Buddha from India? Many Christ mythers believe Jesus did not exist and was plagiarized from early legends, like that of Buddha. Mysticists claim that Buddha was born on December 25th of the Virgin Maya. His birth was attended by wise men and a star of announcement. He was pronounced ruler of the world. His life was threatened by a king who wanted to destroy him. He was of royal lineage. He taught in a temple at age 12. He crushed the serpent's head and was tempted by an evil demon, Mara. He was baptized in water with the Spirit of God present. He was a miracle worker and even fed 500 men from a small basket of cakes. He abolished idolatry. His followers were obligated to renounce the world and live in poverty. He glowed during a transfiguration on a mountain, died on a cross, according to some traditions. His tomb was supernaturally opened, where he ascended bodily to nirvana. He is said to return in the latter days, to return the world to order and judge the dead. So if all these things were true, then one could potentially assert Jesus was a copy of Buddha, but there are several problems with these assertions from mysticists. Before we go through these, we first need to note the first biography of Buddha was not written until the 2nd century AD. So any source of Buddha's legend already postdates Jesus. Obviously the legend of Buddha is older than this, But if one is going to assert Christians stole the legend of Buddha to craft Jesus, they need concrete evidence, not rely on sources that post-date Jesus. Because if there was actually borrowing going on, Christians can just assert it goes in the opposite direction, that the legend of Buddha was changed over time. Now, Buddha was never said to be born on December 25th, but the 8th day of the 4th lunar month. His mother was named Maya, but so what? There is no evidence the name Mary comes from this. Scholars note Mary comes from the earlier Hebrew name Miriam. Buddha was not born of a virgin. The later Christian author Jerome said this was true, but he is not the most reliable source for the legend of Buddha. Scholar Edward Thomas said, "The oldest account of Buddha's ancestry appears to presuppose nothing abnormal about his birth, and merely speaks of him being well born both on his mother's and father's side of 7 generations. According to the later legends, he is born not as other human beings, but in the same way as a universal king. He descends from the Tutsitsa heaven by his own choice, and with this his father is not concerned. This is not properly a virgin birth, but it may be called pathogenetic, that is, Sotodana was not his progenitor." I can find no mention of a star or angels. There were wise men as advisors to Buddha's father, but he was a wealthy king, so he would have had them at his disposal. This next one is not true at all. The closest one can find is at his birth. It was said he would have the option of becoming a great ruler or a spiritual leader. This next one is also not true. What the legend actually says is Buddha was prophesied to leave the palace and become a holy man, so his father tried to prevent that from ever happening, and Buddha had to later escape. Buddha was of royal lineage, but this is too vague to form a parallel. There is no mention of Buddha ever teaching in a temple at age 12. The 2nd century biography only suggests the young Buddha was able to learn very quickly. The New Testament never says Jesus crushed the head of a snake. It was later Christian authors who drew this parallel to Genesis 3. And it was a 12th century Hindu scholar who said Buddha slew a snake. Buddha was tempted by the demon Mara, but it doesn't compare to the temptation of Jesus. There was no mention of bread being thrown off a temple or being offered all the kingdoms of the world. There is no source where Buddha was said to be baptized, and no mention he fed 500 from a basket of cakes. And being a miracle worker is far too general to form any parallel. It is not said that Jesus abolished idolatry, but preached against it. Either way, I can find no reference that Buddha did this either. Buddha's followers were called to renounce the world and live in poverty, but Christians were not called to live in poverty in the New Testament. Jesus called people of many different walks of life, and there is no evidence all Christians are supposed to be poor. Yes, some are given that calling, but not all. There is no evidence of a transfiguration on a mount. Buddha was just said to glow because of his enlightenment. There is no tradition that says Buddha died on a cross, or buried in the tomb. Nirvana is not a place one ascends, but a state of being. A late Chinese document says Buddha opened his coffin to speak, but then closed it again. Buddha is not said to return. There will be a future enlightened Buddha, but that will be a different person entirely. So once again, like with the other legends that mysticists try, we can easily point out there is no evidence Jesus was just a myth based on Buddha. Was Jesus based on the Greek god Dionysos? Many mysticists think Jesus never existed and was just a copy of the god Dionysos, because Dionysos was born of a virgin on December 25th. He was a traveling teacher who performed miracles. He was called Holy Child and placed in a manger. He turned water into wine and was known as God of the Vine. He rode in the triumphant procession on a donkey. He was a king that was ritually killed and eaten in a Eucharistic ritual. He rose from the dead on March 25th. He was depicted as being hung on a tree or crucified. He was called King of Kings, God of Gods, begotten Son, Savior, Redeemer, Anointed One, and the Alpha and Omega. And he has the same trial as Jesus. So do we have proof Jesus was just a mythic copy of the god Dionysos? Well, for that to be true, some of these claims would have to be correct, but most of them are simply wrong. First, Dionysos was not born on December 25th, or even of a virgin. One legend says he was a son of Zeus and Persephone. Another says he was born to Semele after he was impregnated by Zeus, who took the form of a lightning bolt. Hera became jealous and killed her. However, the prenatal form of Dionysos remained. Zeus took him and sewed him into his thigh until he was ready to be born. This is nothing like what happened to Jesus. There is also no reference to him being born on December 25th. This was just made up out of thin air. This next one is true, but it is universal truth for any divine religious teacher. There is no evidence Dionysos was ever called Holy Child or placed in a manger. This is also just made up out of thin air. He did turn water into wine, but this account comes from Achilles Tatius, whose work is much later than the Book of John. And scholars say it is more likely the pagans were parroting the Eucharist of the Christians. As for being called God of the Vine, this was actually never said of Jesus. Jesus called himself a vine to make a point about growing spiritually in him, which had nothing to do with wine or calling himself the god of the grapevine. Dionysos is depicted riding a mule, while crowds are waving ivy branches, mainly because this is how the ancient Greco-Roman culture treated kingly figures. If a triumphant king was entering your city, this was the customary way to greet him, and it was done for Roman emperors, generals, and religious figures. So this was done quite often in the ancient world, and is way too general to force any type of parallel. The next one is not true, and seems to be taken from a misunderstood story of Dionysos. One legend Diodorus reports is that Dionysos was taken by Titans when he was a child, and they boiled and ate him. Zeus found out and killed the Titans and restored him back to life from the heart that was left over. There is no evidence this was ever done ritually by human followers of Dionysos. I can find no evidence Dionysos rose from the dead, let alone on March 25th, and no evidence he was depicted as hung on a tree or crucified. This supposed depiction of him is a late forgery from the early 20th century. There is no evidence he was called King of Kings, God of Gods, Begotten Son, or any of these other titles that are applied to Christ. Finally, anyone can read the trial of Dionysos and the Bacchae and see the trial is nothing like what happened to Jesus, despite what freaking Gandhi say. Dionysos was put on trial for making women go mad. He lets himself be taken so he can publicly humiliate King Pentheus. He then escapes from prison by an earthquake and has the women kill Pentheus. Dionysos is also described in homoerotic terms. This is nothing like the trial of Jesus. The only similarity seems to be that they were both on trial, which is far too general to form any parallel. So as you can see, the only parallels that are remotely true are far too general to form any connection. So that means there is no evidence Jesus was just a myth based on Dionysos. Was Jesus based on the Hindu god Krishna? Many mysticists think Jesus never existed and was just a legend stolen from the story of Krishna, because Krishna was born of a virgin on December 25th. His birth was signaled by a star in the east and attended by angels and shepherds and presented with spices. He was persecuted by a tyrant who slaughtered thousands of infants. He is depicted with a foot on a serpent. He was a miracle worker. He taught through parables. He argued with the Hindu priests and called them hypocrites. He had a beloved disciple, whose name translated to John. He was killed at the age of 30, rose from the dead, and ascended to heaven. It is said he will return to earth on a white horse to kill an evil prince. He was crucified on a tree between two thieves. He was said to be the lion of the tribe of Saki, and he was the second person of the Hindu Trimurti. So do we have proof Jesus was a mythic copy of the god Krishna? Well, for that to be true, some of these claims would have to be factually correct, but many of them are false or total distortions. First, Krishna was not born on December 25th. All evidence shows he was born in the summer, and he was not born of a virgin. His mother had 7 children prior to Krishna. Krishna was just said to have been conceived without sexual intercourse. There is no evidence of a star signaling his birth. There were Hindu angels at his birth, but not shepherds. They were cowherds. And no spices, just flowers divinely given from heaven. These next two are actually true. He was said to be persecuted by a tyrant who slaughtered infants, and he is depicted on a serpent. But Jesus is not depicted this way in the New Testament, nor do early Christians present him like this. This came about later from Christians, but it doesn't even parallel to Krishna, who was actually dancing on the head of a serpent with 1,000 heads in order to defeat it. Nothing like this ever happens in the Bible. Krishna was a miracle worker, but all deities are said to be, so this is too general to form any parallel. The next one is partially true. Krishna did teach, but not through parables. So generally just being a teacher is also way too general to make any type of parallel. It is also true Krishna did attack the Hindu priests for focusing too much on rituals. However, this next one is completely false. There is no evidence of a linguistic connection between these two names. John is just the English word for the name Yohanan and has no connection to India. Krishna was not killed around the age of 30. He lived to be well over 100. It is also false Krishna rose from the dead. After he died, his spirit just ascended into heaven, which is not a physical resurrection like what happened to Christ. It is a distortion of the myth to say Krishna is supposed to return on a white horse. A future incarnation of him is supposed to ride a white horse and kill all evildoers, which is similar to a view of how Christ will return. But this view of Christ is only one view in Christian eschatology. There is no evidence Krishna was crucified on a tree between two thieves, no evidence he was said to be the lion of the tribe of Saki, and he was not called the second person of the Hindu Trimurti. He was one of the 10 avatars of Vishnu, which is more modalistic than anything. So some of these claims are false, but the parallels that are actually true have no power either, since Hindu scholars say Hindus were borrowing from Christian sources. Some scholars believe that, except for the name, the Krishna cycle of stories has borrowed extensively from Christian sources, especially in relation to the birth, childhood, and divinity of Jesus. The great Orientalist, Sir William Jones, held that the spurious Gospels, which abounded in the first years of Christianity, found their way to India and were known to the Hindus. According to others, Krishna's victory over Kaliya is a travested version of Christ's victory over Satan, the serpent. The German writer Weber held that Krishnaism was indebted to Christianity on the grounds that the worship of Krishna as the sole deity was a post-Christian phase in Hinduism, and the legend of his birth and the celebration of his birthdays, the honor paid to his mother, Devika, and his life as a herdsman all showed Christian influence. Summing up all the data, Hopkins says, considering how late are these Krishna legends in India, there can be no doubt that the Hindus borrowed the tales, but not in name. Dr. Edwin Bryant says these stories of Krishna that are similar to Christianity can only be dated as early as between the 4th and 6th century, with another scholar suggesting they may be as early as the 2nd century, which is still too late to say the Gospels were a copy of them. So in reality, there is some borrowing, but scholarship suggests it happened the other way around, which would make sense, since many of these stories about Krishna come from tales that postdate Jesus. So since that is the case, there is no evidence Jesus was just a myth based on Krishna.